Well, 2023, back for another episode of Commentator's Corner. It's episode number 15, and I've got the pleasure of a man that I've worked alongside many a time. Hello, Mr. Daniel Gilligan. Good to have you on the show.
Hello, Alex. Yes, it's very nice to be on the show. Yeah, thank you for having me.
And firstly, thanks a lot to subscribing to the YouTube channel as well. You probably got you had a little bit of a scout around and saw what Commentator's Corner was all about. But just really before we get into like the routine questions that I have for all our guests and everything, what do you do apart from commentary? Is there anything else that you do? Because we have talked, but not many people might know what else you do outside of hosting or commentary. Is there anything else that you take pride as part of your working ethos, so to speak?
Yeah, so there's quite a few things. So I say that as if I'm inundated with work all of the time. I'm not. It's often famine rather than feast for me. But yeah, I work totally freelance these days since May last year. And that's been very, very freeing for me because my main career, if you like, is working as an actor. So I've when I've been in full-time jobs before or even part-time jobs, an awful lot of your time, I think just the way that I am as a worker, I get very I dive in and I throw a lot of effort into something. So that's then meant that when I've been doing these jobs that are supposed to be just giving me money between the acting jobs, I've then actually ended up putting more time into those jobs than I have done into the acting. So it's one of those awkward situations for me in the past. But now that I'm freelance, I've been able to much more effectively manage these sorts of things. So acting is kind of the main thing. That's been on screen mostly, either with my face actually in front of a camera or in animation and voiceover and things like that, or adverts and other bits and pieces. And then in addition to that, I do events for a company called KLH Brand Advocates, who is owned and run by Chris Lawton. Wonderful man, not just saying that because he's the paymaster. And it's all about telling stories. We work with a Formula One team. I'm not sure if we're allowed to say which team. So that's why I'll just sort of err on the side of caution here. But we work with a Formula One team, and it's essentially it's all about storytelling. It's all about being able to immerse somebody within the culture, within the ideas, within the achievements of the organization. Because if you simply just go over and go, oh, well, this car is from 19 something something, and it had this many wins, and it had this much horsepower, and it did this, and blah, 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 then, that's going to work for a certain criteria of people, a certain type of fan. But if you are a sponsor or a partner, or you're a prospective customer, or whatever it happens to be, then that may not work for you. Instead, you need that human element that, well, this car went off and it had a very successful season, but unfortunately its sister car went to pre-season testing and never came back. All of a sudden you've got this intrigue there, there's this something that you can then actually gravitate onto, and you can listen to the stories about the team, about the people behind it, not just the drivers, but the technical personnel, the people there. Because of course, modern Formula One teams are going to be something in the region of about 800 people who are all working behind the scenes in order to make that car, those three, four cars run over the course of a season. So whilst the drivers are very, very important, they are certainly not the be all end all. Without those 800 people or so there, you're not going to have that car to go racing and winning with. So yeah.
So in other words, we've got our first ever thespian in terms of an actor here on Commentator's Corner. So that's a big first
exactly.
to kick off 2023 in the right way. So thanks for that wonderful insight, Daniel. First question. How did you get bitten by the motorsport bug, and who was the biggest influence in that happening?
Very easy to answer this question. I was 4 years old when I was plopped down in front of the television with my dad, and he's I'm half Yorkshire and half Scottish, and my dad is the Scottish half, and so he's sat me down in front of the television and said, right, that driver there, that's David Coulthard. He's from the same place as us. So that's the one that we support. I'm like, okay. and so him and McLaren, obviously McLaren didn't know at the time that it was set up by a New Zealander, but I just saw a team that had muck at the start. And as a 4-year-old, I made the connection. Oh, it must be a Scottish team. So, let's get behind them. So I've been a McLaren fan since I was 4 years old. And that's all down to my dad.
Oh, brilliant. I mean, that's a wonderful story. And also that the accent, of course, being part Scottish had to be on point. Otherwise, a lot of people would have gone, well, actually, he doesn't sound Scottish one iota at all.
No.
But moving on from that, what was the first race weekend or race event that you went to trackside in terms of motorsport?
So that's the thing. We've never really been in a position where we've been able to do that sort of thing, either because of geographically or financially or whatever it happens to be. So whilst I've been a Formula One fan and a McLaren fan since I was 4 years old, so all the way back in 2000, I didn't actually get to go to a race until 2018. It was the British Grand Prix that year, which was just a couple of months after I had actually started working for McLaren. Because before I went off to do events with KLH, working for teams and things like that, I actually somehow managed to get a full-time gig working at the McLaren Formula One team. I did that for about 6 months on the shop floor, making Formula One cars. It was not in events or anything like that, which my background might indicate would be where I would go. But instead, I somehow managed to wangle my way into a job. So it was a few months in. I'd the first race debrief that we had after I got hired was for Canada. So that race weekend had just been and gone when I first came on. So Silverstone, I was a few races into the team at that point, and it was great to be there, to feel the atmosphere and everything. I've always been a Hamilton fan as well, since his GP2 season in 2006. So he was. It was perhaps not the greatest weekend for Hamilton fans, in that he was punted off, albeit accidentally, race incident by Kimi at the first corner. But then seeing him, I suppose that then gave you a greater feeling, really, because you got that satisfaction of seeing him then carve his way through the field, doing what Lewis does best, really, which is driving angry and getting the bit between his teeth and just making up as many positions as he could. And so second place by the end of it was fantastic to watch. So yeah, Silverstone was the first one, and hope to go back there at some point again in hopefully the near future, because time and circumstance are making it slightly more plausible that I might be able to do that.
Well, that's a really good positive thing to hear. Now, 2018, was that when Zach Brown was still that was in his early years, wasn't it, at McLaren?
That was his first full year as head of the organization. Yeah, because it was 2017 was when Ron left, and so then Zach sort of, this, as far as I'm aware, at least, he sort of then picked up the organization in the latter half of that year, or in the off season, and then has been riding ever since. Zach's one of those people who is just a fantastic team boss. He's the sort of person you would want leading an organization that you work for, because he listens to people. So I was, as I say, I only worked at McLaren for 6 months before I was sacked. But it was a mutual sacking, I like to say, because it was all ended on good terms and all that sort of thing. But yeah, in that time whilst I was there, during this initial, I want to say 3 months, something like that, I hit upon an idea, of which I'm not going to divulge the details, because Zach quite liked this idea. So in case they ever want to use it in the future, I'm not going to say what it was. But I basically just fired an email across over to him and said, hey, I've got this idea, and would you be interested in reading about it? And the guy, for someone who he'd never interacted with before, who was a total nobody at the bottom of the ladder in the organization, he took 30 minutes out of his incredibly busy schedule to have a one-on-one meeting with me. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that's the best sort of leader you want in an organization. Someone who listens, someone who actually puts in the time to listen to their employees. And when it's a good idea, he says it's a good idea, and it gives you that lift. And so I went into work very happy for about the next month afterwards.
The big old Cheshire cat grin on your face, Mr. Gilligan, as well. But that's a wonderful story. I mean, that's so great to hear. And like you say, I mean, whenever we see Zach on camera, or he's really, really showcased a great candor about himself. He's very, very easygoing, but we all know that when there's someone as cool and as calm and as collected as Zach Brown, he's like a duck. He's calm on the surface, but paddling like heck behind that sort of that front, if you will. How did you get into commentary, Daniel? And was there a particular person that got you involved, so to speak?
I mean, to a certain extent there was. I mean, so what ended up happening was essentially in 2020, when of course the world ended, as we all remember, I was living in northeast London at the time, because London is based, I mean, to a certain extent, Manchester and Glasgow can also do this, but as an actor in the UK, realistically, the only place you can live is London. And certainly at that time, when the idea of recording an audition and sending it in was barely even heard of. Now it's fairly industry practice. We call it self-tape in the creative industry. And so what we ended up having was it was myself and 3 other actors in this house in northeast London, a house which I'm fairly certain was illegal. There was like an awful lot of dwellings in London, it was not fit for purpose. There was in my room in particular, so my room was actually the living room. And I initially, on moving in, thought, wow, I've been able to wangle this living room. This is fantastic. This is one of the biggest rooms in the whole house. I quickly discovered why nobody else wanted that room, because the floorboards didn't fit together. And when you looked through them,
oh dear, you
saw the outside world. So as a result of an evening, especially in the winter, it was very cold in that room. But anyways, getting sidetracked there. We were then told by our landlord they were intending to get rid of us anyway, because there were changes to the London Borough were changing their rules around house of multiple occupation. So we were no longer going to be able to stay there anyway, unless we had suddenly all entered a polyamorous marriage or some such thing. Yeah, so we were already thinking about going as it was. I think it was June maybe that we were going to be turfed out. But then obviously the pandemic came along. We kind of made it through the first couple of months okay, but then we were just like, can we leave in May? Can you just let us go in May? Is that fine? And they said yes, thankfully. The estate agents were less than pleased, but that's a story for another time. And so I gathered all my stuff and I moved back in with my dad up just outside of Glasgow in Scotland. It's the house that he finally owns. He's now finally a homeowner in his 50s, because he was in the Air Force for his career up until his move to the private sector a few years ago. So he never really had anywhere to kind of lay down roots and things like that. We were just moving from one military base to another. And so yeah, I ended up then living with them during the worst bit of COVID, moved back down to London in September 2020. But it was whilst I was up there, I was a regular, and still am a regular user of the Formula One subreddit. And on there, they announced the R Formula One Racing League. Where it was just the idea of getting people together during the pandemic and enjoying sim racing together, because that was basically all we had. Because, the F1 season had been called off, Australia was no longer happening, and all these sorts of things. So I basically messaged him because I was, I'm relatively handy behind the wheel of a virtual racing car, but I'm nowhere near as competitive as actually quick people. And it depends on the title as well. If you put me in the F1 games, I'm probably well above average, but as we discovered relatively recently on a SimStaff event in Assetto Corsa Competizione, I'm a bit terrible in that game. So so I basically messaged in saying, hey, I'm not the most confident of drivers. However, I am an actor. I have a vocal performance background. I have the knowledge of how to be able to essentially, I can project to the back of the National and do it for a month every single night without my voice going. So, the idea of doing a race for an hour and a half is I thought at the time, at least, having zero experience in it at this point, I thought to myself, this will be child's play. This will be easy. And so the mod who's no longer with the mod team at R Formula One, who's Flip Jacobson. He's again, lovely chap, Brazilian as well. So we had a bit of a connection there. He's a PK fan though, rather than a Senna fan like me. So it was a so he's still a Senna fan. Don't get me wrong, but his hero is PK. This was all before PK has said and done various things, though, so I don't know whether his opinion has changed.
Does that include when he tried to kick Elio De Angelis in the bollocks back at the Hockenheim ring? If anyone might remember that one. Yeah, but then all the hoo-ha between him and Arnage in the mid-'80s when PK was, Nelson PK Senior, I do have to admit, and we have all seen what's been talked about, reference PK Senior saying very, very inappropriate, unpolitically correct things.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so I messaged him, pointed out that I have the microphone, I have the kit, I have the training. Do you want me as the commentator for this thing? And he said, sure, let's do that. And so for the first season, what it was me recording the races with me commentating and then cutting them down into a smaller sort of highlights package for YouTube. But the problem is living in rural Scotland, your internet's a bit terrible. And so I was never actually able to upload any of it. I still have them on a drive somewhere. So maybe for historical reasons, I can upload them to the league at some point. But yeah, so that was my beginning really, and it became this pet project. Started as the R Formula One Racing League, then to the Formula Reddit series, and then it's been rebranded again to FRS. And through a series of strange circumstances, I'm now in the sort of it's referred to as the commissioner role. In that, i.e., I have ultimate control over the F1 side of things. We've also got a sim server for other sim racing titles, which I've got less of a hands-on role with. So very much the F1 side of things is sort of my remit, if you like. But I've got a great team of admins who do all the hard work. Really, I'm just the one who slaps my face on it and commentates on the division, the top division. So yes, that's how we got started really, and Flip is really the reason why I was able to get that opportunity to get going really. And then we had we've got other great folks over there as well, like Greg Harrison, also known as Harringzord, Sean Provenza, known as Quimbulus. Those guys are great at what they do as well, and Sean in particular is our head of broadcasting admin. So he handles all of those sorts of things. He makes some wonderful VTs before the race gets started, which we commentate over. Has nice fun track facts. It has other bits and pieces in there. It's got wonderful panning shots as well because of some glitch with the game where you can break photo mode. So yeah, it's a great little organization. It's good fun. Yeah.
Right. I haven't really, because of the fact that this has been organised within the last 48 hours of us recording this episode, I haven't been able to find out anything silly on social media about Daniel. But I'm sure that because I don't know if I actually follow you on any social media, but that can be changed or whatever. But we'll skip that part because obviously the thespian story at the beginning makes up for that. But then also the fact of talking about Scottish internet. Actually, yeah, being in case in points. I mean, if you ask Jake Sanson when he's up in Cheshire, there's that good old Chester dial-up. Always works a treat. Yeah. But you briefly touched on favourite drivers. I mean, of course, David Coulthard was the one that your dad said, look, that's David Coulthard. We need to support him. He's from here. You mentioned Ayrton Senna. A lot of people loved the fact of how he was so different from everybody else. Are there any other particular drivers that you followed over the course of your tenure as a motorsport fan?
There have been other drivers to differing extents. I think that as I've gotten older, the relationship with it has gotten a bit more healthy, I guess you could say, because obviously as a kid you sort of you want to back your horse and you want to say no, they're mine and so on. Obviously Senna I learned about after the fact because he of course passed away in 1st of May 94 and I was born in October 95, so there was never actually a point where we were both alive at the same time. So Senna I've kind of gone back after because I like to think that I'm something of an amateur historian for Formula One. When I was working at McLaren, I got to know Neil Trundle very well, and he was recently at MTC doing an event, and he's said to the likes of Matthew Jeffries and others, obviously it was around the time when they've then gone off to do this video with the MP44 that's blown up on YouTube a bit recently, which is great to see. But yeah, he sort of touted me as an amateur historian. I got asked by Matthew Jeffries, I just got put on the spot straight away. I was like, who was it who won this particular race in this particular year, and what was the car? And I knew the car and the driver because I didn't know the car and driver who had won the race, but then when he said afterwards, I was like, oh yeah, no, I know who those drivers are and that team and that car and all that sort of thing. Okay, I'll note that for future. And it's failing to come to me right this second as to who it was. And I know it was a Brabham. That's what I remember. It was a Brabham, and it was Regazzoni, I think that was Lauda's teammate in 76, wasn't it?
Yes, because the fact, effectively, because that was when Brabham was actually owned by Bernie Eccleston.
Yes, yeah. And it was, I think it was, I want to say it was Germany in 74 was the race in question. But yeah, anyway, so anyway, back to your original question. Tangents and me, we have a great relationship. But
likewise.
So we have Coulthard and Senna, two drivers that I've loved very, very much. I think all of my drivers that I've really followed have had some connection to McLaren, to be honest, because McLaren has always been my team that I've supported all the way through my F1 love affair, really. So 23 years now I've been supporting McLaren. And so drivers will come through. So these days, for instance, I mean, like Lando, I met whilst I was at McLaren. Met him at the Mexican Grand Prix in 2018. That was the second motorsport event I went to. And even back then, when he was the reserve driver for the team, he was in F2. He was doing all these things. He was much as he is these days, a very approachable, very nice young man who's very much got his head, screwed on his shoulders. So I support Lando. I loved Carlos when he was at McLaren. I still have a bit of a love for Carlos, but he's gone to the dark side now. So we're not sure how much we can support it. Certainly, though, given his McLaren connection, I support him more than I do Charles Leclerc.
As a character, yes, but because he's now gone to the mark of the Cavallino Rampante. Damn you! Exactly. But I still remember when Carlos got the infamous nut shot, and the box cup was then made for him, especially after, I think, who was it that did it to him? Must have, I think it was
Danny Rick.
It was Danny Rick when he was still with Renault before he replaced Carlos.
Yes.
And I still remember the it's like oi, like this rough Spanish undercurrent. I was just like thinking. And I was like thinking he's picked that up off of Lando. No Spaniard in their right mind will say "oi" in that kind of vernacular, unless you were with a British teammate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, anybody else in particular, like say from the world of sports cars or other tin top, other series?
Well, this is the thing, is that with others, if we briefly keep it within Formula One for just another couple of seconds, we've got Hamilton and Alonso. Both of them fantastic drivers. I mean, Alonso in particular, you really got a sense of just how impressive he was in 2018. Like when you were in the team, you were seeing what he was able to do and what Stoffel was not. And then, of course, that's in addition to all of his various achievements prior to that point. And then Lewis for obvious reasons. I actually had a conversation with one of our team members at the time, who's still there and who I won't name in case this were to be embarrassing for them. But they had worked with various drivers over the course of their career. And I asked them, of the drivers you haven't worked with, who would you want to work with? And they sat there for a moment, they thought about it, and they said, Hamilton. And it's like, oh, so you weren't here when Lewis was here? And he said, no, I was a different team. And he explained how essentially what happened within McLaren, and I would imagine what probably happens inside Mercedes as well, is that Hamilton would, over the course of Friday and Saturday practice sessions, Hamilton and his teammate would go out, they would do all of their data gathering, because you get over 1.5 to 2 terabytes worth of data in just text files alone from Formula One cars over the course of a race weekend. So there's an awful lot to churn through. And they'd go out, and then for the qualifying session that would then come through, there would be a theoretical pole time. and a theoretical best time that the car was capable of achieving. So, of course, if they were the same thing, then McLaren are in contention for, or Mercedes, in the case of his latter half of his career, are in contention for pole position. And he then would go out and set a time faster than what was the theoretical maximum the car was capable of achieving. And that's something which is something that's remarkable to me, and clearly to the engineers and everybody else as well. It's and one of the reasons why people who haven't worked with him do want to work with him, because he's able to just do something amazing with that car. And I'd imagine that's something that's relatively common to all of the all the greats, shall we say. But outside of Formula One, I must confess I don't really have that much of a deep knowledge of other racing series, really. I mean, I've started to get a bit into IndyCar and Formula E because of McLaren's involvement over there. Extreme E as well, I suppose. There's I've liked seeing what Pato O'Ward's been doing in IndyCar. He's had his very, very bright moments over there. It would be interesting to see this year now, with a couple of seasons under his belt, see if he's now going to be able to have that consistency to be able to challenge for the championship, and with the team now bedded in as well, and more funding and buyout of Schmidt-Peterson and all that sort of a thing. It's it'll be interesting to see whether or not we have now that combination of things that you need in order to do well in IndyCar. So Pato, I'd say, is one that I would have a look at over there as well.
That's pretty cool, mate. Okay, next question. And it's relating to drivers, but have you ever been starstruck by a racing driver that you've met? Now, you have mentioned Mr. Norris. I mean, obviously, with regards to having been able to go to Grand Prix through working with McLaren, of course, you mentioned about the Mexican Grand Prix. Is there anyone that's really sort of like you've just gone, I didn't really realize that I was going to feel like this when this happened?
There was somebody who I met who I knew exactly how I was going to feel, and then it was an even greater feeling than that, which I was expecting, and that was when I met David Coulthard, because he'd been this childhood hero of mine. Supported him all the way through from that initial seeing him in 2000 on the TV, all the way through to 2008 when he retired, and then it was the same Grand Prix, Mexico 2018. I managed to collar him for a second, just be like, hey, the reason I am here, or one of the reasons I'm here, is you. You're the inspiration to get me to this point. So thank you, essentially, and a couple of other gushing fan moments. If I have one regret of that whole weekend, it's that I ran around and I met a lot of people, but I never took a single photo of me with drivers. I took a couple of photos. One of my colleagues at the time took a photo of me outside the garage. It's one of my favorite photos that I have. And I took a photo of like down the pit lane. So from the pit gantry, so you had the McLaren pit gantry above, and then looking down towards the pit lane entry. And so they're the only photos I have of that entire weekend. And so it was, but Coulthard definitely. But then sort of running around, and this is the thing though, is that it's something that you learn relatively quickly in Formula One, I guess, is that they're just people. They're exactly like you and me. They're just very good at what they do. And what they do is a very, very specific job. Now, that's not to say that they're not good at other things as well, because they certainly are. But yeah, once you've met maybe sort of one or two of them, and maybe when you've met some idols and things like that, suddenly they then become very, very human to you. It becomes very easy to interact with them. Not to the extent you become familiar, because that's not appropriate unless, of course, you genuinely are familiar with them and friendly and so on. But these days I can meet people, I can bump into people, and not really be too starstruck or too fussed, really. Now I say all that. I'm sure if I met Lewis one day, it would be total, fangirling all over the place. But it would be, but that's maybe my last exception to the rule. I think even if because Seb Vettel grew on me an awful lot after he left Red Bull, for example. Hated him when he was at Red Bull. Love him now. Yeah. And so I think even if I met him and all the achievements he's gathered. And I think maybe of all the drivers, maybe the most similar to me in that he geeks out on the past as well, and he loves all of his F1 history and things like that too. Yeah, probably would not be too geeked out if I met Sebastian Vettel. It would be cool, don't get me wrong. And if there was an opportunity to, I'd take it with both hands. But yes, no, that's very much yeah. The fangirling is reserved for a very select few at this point.
Now, with any commentator, Daniel, everyone has the unique style, but then us commentators like you and me, we all have idols. I mean, of course, I would imagine there's always one that is always on the end of everyone's lips, which is always the great late Murray Walker, who's one of those guys. And at that point, I think, yeah, when you started watching Formula One, when your dad told you to watch Mr. Coulthard and the McLaren, just trying to remember who was on at that point. I think it might have been Jonathan Ledgard or maybe James Allen at that point, if I remember.
I think I just managed to catch the end of Murray's time, actually. I think it was 2001 brilliant. Is maybe when he stopped, I want to say. Because I definitely have memories of him commentate. Like they're way back there in the back of my head with like very, very old early life memories and things like that, but I definitely remember hearing his voice. Now, whether that was as a result of watching like a VT as part of the, you know, the build up to a race or something, or whether it was the race itself, I don't remember. But yeah, it's I mean, I certainly have memories of Murray, and then of course, as I say, being something of an F1 historian, I've gone back and watched races, both on F1 TV and through other means of acquiring old races, shall we say. And yeah, it's so Murray's definitely up there. He's definitely one of them. James Allen then was the majority of, I mean, it was James Allen, Martin Brundle was the majority of my early years of watching it, all the way through up until, of course, the end of 2008 when it went then back to the BBC. Then I forget the name of the commentator who was then on for 2009 and possibly 2010 as
I think it might have been Jonathan Ledgard.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Jonathan Ledgard.
Yeah, which whilst the name escaped me there, I see a lot of criticism for him on the internet, and I don't necessarily understand the criticism. I quite liked his commentary style. It was clear and concise and got the job done. I mean, maybe that's the thing. Maybe it just lacks that flair that people were expecting or used to seeing or wanted to see, possibly. So maybe that's the reason why. But then, of course, you've got that year, which then everybody, I think, has a bit of sort of rose-tinted spectacles about, which is 2011, which here in the UK, at least, was then another year of the BBC having exclusive broadcasting rights. And it was Martin Brundle in lead commentator role and David Coulthard in the role that Martin had for a number of years up until that point. And whilst it was very, very good, I don't think it's the greatest of all time that a lot of people tout it to be, because I think that Martin was maybe uncomfortable in that lead commentary role, or sometimes it felt that way to me, at least. So yeah, I mean, it was interesting. And then, of course, after that, Sky then gets involved, and so you've then got David Croft and Martin on that side. But I never really watched that, because at that point you still had sort of live simulcast with the BBC, and it was then you started to get things like there was a split between, okay, half the races are live, half of them are highlights, and all these other deals that ended up happening with free-to-air television in the UK. And for me, I think if we were to, I mean, so going back to the crux of the question in sort of idols and things like that, I think that for me, I would say Murray's up there for sure. Then I could very, very confidently say Ben Edwards. Ben Edwards for me is absolutely top tier. And the fact that, so technically I'm not supposed to have F1 TV owing to the fact I live in the United Kingdom, but there are ways and means, dear boy, of getting these things. And so, you know, last season I was watching on F1 TV.
Yeah.
And for a lot of the broadcast, not quite all of them, but for a lot of the broadcasts on the F1 TV audio feed, rather than listen to the Sky feed, you had Ben Edwards in commentary. And that was my go-to. If he was on commentary for a weekend, I would listen to him every single time. Because him plus, you know, Jolyon Palmer and Sam Collins, they form a really formidable team. And so Ben, even back when I was first starting to get into it, I remember my first ever video game first ever video game was F1 2002 on the PS2, and it wasn't the EA one. It was the one that was made by Sony. It was like the PlayStation exclusive one.
Mm-hmm.
But packaged with that game was a DVD of the 2001 season review, I guess you could say, which had Ben Edwards doing the voiceover for it. They didn't use commentary from sort of live at the time in the race. It was him doing sort of summary of the action you were watching of that particular race and all these sorts of things. So he was unknowingly to me, because at that point in history and life and everything, you're only around about 6-7 years old. You don't really, and the internet wasn't really a thing in the early 2000s either, I want to say as well. Certainly not in my house, it wasn't. We had, like the beige CRT monitor with a beige computer next to it that had the dial-up connection. Beep, 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 beep,
the one that you had to get the organ grind, the organ winder to sort of get going, didn't you?
Exactly, and you couldn't be on the phone at the same time, and because otherwise.
Oh, I remember that. Oh my god,
yeah. So yeah, I'm at that age where I'm sort of I'm too young really to sort of sympathize with all the people who were like, it was good in the good old days. But I'm also old enough where I can say to the young folks, I know what a VHS tape is and you don't. And it's like,
as soon as I say the words Betamax,
yeah.
I mean, I still remember going, like all of the cool kids, like all of the most of the cool kids with the families, they'd all have VHS. Then you'd have the odd one out. You'd have the one that go, yeah, we use Betamax. It's like, why did I bring my videos around on the sleepover then? Oh no, I got that one as well. So it's like you had one person that was the Betamax like divergent, so to speak.
The connoisseur. Do you know the story as to why VHS ended up winning out over Betamax?
I can't remember.
No, so it was down to one industry in particular, and this might be the first time this industry has been brought up on your podcast. So
go on.
It was the pornographic industry. They used VHS, so therefore that became the popular format for everything else because there was so much money in it. So there you go. Fun fact, and the first time I think pornography has been mentioned on your.
We've had thespianism and pornography in the first episode of Commentator's Corner in 2023, and actually in its history. So
exactly.
Well done, Mr. Gilligan. There's two stigmatisms you brought in. Well, through a career choice, and then also through a little bit of tactful knowledge. I do have to say.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, but anyway, yeah. So Ben Edwards, Murray Walker, and then I'd put Coulthard up there as well because I feel like for the time that I've been watching, he's been a great addition to any commentary team. He's able to give that insight, give that knowledge and perspective, and he knows when to step up to talk and when to step back and all these sorts of things. And then of course you've got to have Martin Brundle in there as well. Absolutely got to for me. So they'd be the four, I would say, as far as my idols, my inspirations, my whatever you want to call them. But I would say I don't actively try and avoid parroting them, but there is a conscious effort in my head to sort of do your own thing, do it from it, because a lot of it comes from sort of the actor training and things like that, where it's like you don't want to plagiarize the performance, but at the same time there will be themes that are similar because of the nature of it. If you're looking at a character, for example, you break down the text, you do all your research, you do all these various character tasks that you've got as an actor.
Yeah.
If you take it seriously, that is. So some of the people I've worked with who they're just like, oh, I've just turned up, I've learned my lines. Have you done nothing to like prep for this other than learn? Like, no. Oh, right, okay, we're gonna have fun. It's but you do all these things, and obviously there will then be similarities. If you receive a character who is from a particular background, has a particular set of views and a particular this, that, and the other, then you're going to be doing something similar. Like if you're playing like a longshoreman from 1930s New York, he's probably going to have a New York accent, so you'll probably have a similar performance to everybody else in that sense. He's going to be talking a bit more like this, he's going to be a bit more sort of, what's going on, and so on. And yeah, so there will be similarities in your performances, but for the context in which you're performing. But you want your own interpretation. You want your own, what we would say, your own truth, your own interpretation of things, because ultimately your performance comes from you. You become a different person when you become a character. It's there have been some great studies on this, actually, where they've hooked up actors to sort of, you know, like brain measurement devices and things like that, and they've sort of spoken to them before they get into character, and then when they've been in character, and then back when they're out of character again, and the brain waves that they're transmitting essentially during pre and post character are the same person, but then when they're in character, it is literally their brain lights up like a different human being. And yep. So it's, you know, so you know, it needs to come from you and from a place of truth, and so your understanding of the world and your experiences in the world as well. But if you start to contrive things, if you start to try and invent things that you know, if you Carlos Sainz says stop inventing, then yeah. That's then you know, you end up then coming into problem. That's where you then start to see unconvincing performances. And similarly, I think, whilst I've not seen it necessarily in any of the commentary that I've seen, I think that that's where you would then end up encountering something where something didn't feel quite right if you're watching a commentator, if someone were just to try and parrot somebody else yeah. rather than forging their own way. So yeah.
I think, coming on to what you just said then, that's a very, very good point. It's effectively where, say, for instance, people have their own particular catchphrases for starting races, like with Crofty. It's lights out and away we go. With Murray Walker, and it's go, go, go. George Morgan, our first ever guest, actually says, you know, the first light, the second light, the third light, the fourth light, the fifth light, and then the lights go out. It's pedal to the metal, and it's go, go, and he says go 5 times in a row. And I introed him as the man that says go more times than Murray Walker. And it's like you say, commentary is the art of conveyance, where in a way we are literally a player on the stage, you know, and we're commentating on the people that are either out on the track in both the real or the sim racing world. And at the time we're recording this, people might be wondering why I'm wearing my Rotax racing jacket while I'm heading off to Spain for the Rotax Winter Cup. So I'm going to see some real life motorsport, as in karting, where I've got 34 races over the course of 2 days, plus qualifying to commentate on. And then I've got other bits and pieces. Daniel, wanted to ask you about the following. Name 3 favorite moments in commentary, whether it is involving yourself or somebody else.
3 favorite moments in commentary. I think one of them's got to be the first time that I did a live broadcast. One of the first, yeah, the first time that we did FRS season 2. Obviously, we'd been trying to get some sort of thing happening with highlights in season 1. Hadn't quite worked for the aforementioned internet reasons. Season 2, we then got a guy in called Tom Mack, who then was essentially our director. And they did the streaming element of it, so I didn't then have to, and we didn't have to rely on my connection, which wouldn't have handled it anyway. And so I then just commentated off the Discord feed, basically, which is great because Discord has got basically no latency when you do a video stream. I don't know how they do it. It's witchcraft, but it's very good. And so I think then, just in the knowledge that, and at that point as well, you know, we were still in the pandemic, lots of people still locked in at home, furloughed if they were in the UK and things like that. So so we were all working from home if they weren't, and so we had big viewership. It was, you know, a good 60-70 people or so who were watching us, and so it gave me that sense that you get when you are doing a live theater performance, for example, where you are on the stage and you get an energy from the audience. You know, you don't play up the audience, you don't do anything like that, because that's again, that's going back to what we were talking about before, that's a contrivance, that's taking yourself out of the moment and being self-indulgent rather than playing the truth of the character and of the situation. It's a bit like, you know, when I've done something before. So I did in 2019 we did an episode of Doctor Who, and that was you know, you're up against, you're a human being running around in a jungle that's not actually a jungle. It's a set that's got potted plants everywhere, because and the vases are in shot because we were doing a recreation of a 1960s episode, a lost episode of Doctor Who, which was done in collaboration between the BBC and the institution that I trained as an actor. And so I'd graduated at this point, and they said to me, "Oh, you can do like a great 1960s sort of clipped English accent. Do you want to come in and do this? Just record these couple of lines so I can get it signed off, basically." And so I did that, sent it in. Then all of a sudden I'm hired and I'm being paid as an actor for that was one of the earlier paid jobs in my career. And you go onto the set, and it's, as I say, like it was total recreation of how they did it back then. So everything was very basic. Everything was made out of wood. You had potted plants everywhere, as I say, because, if you go back to some of those episodes from the 60s in Doctor Who, you can see there's just a potted plant there. We're on a jungle planet, but there is clearly a pot there that you can see the thing sprouting out of. So it was all very, very slapdash in a very deliberate way.
Yeah.
But then when you're on the set there and you're up against Daleks and giant plants that are essentially this massive, horrible things that are like a bed sheet over an enormous pole with then things stuck to them and stuff like that, it makes your job, it makes people think that your job is then very difficult, and to a certain extent it is. But the thing again is you've got to play the truth of it. You've got to go in there and you've got to say, no. To the person that I am now, this is terrifying. You're on an alien world. You're surrounded by all sorts of flora and fauna that you don't know about. Suddenly there are these things which the other guy says are called Vaga plants, which are, they're like zombie plants. They shuffle along on their roots to come and get you very slowly. And if they manage to prick you with a thorn, then you'll turn into one of them, and it's horrible. And then you've got Daleks, which are these Nazis in little tanks who want to exterminate everything, and they want to, and all these things. And so you've got to play up the fact that, that's terrifying, even though in your head you're thinking, this is ridiculous, this is silly.
It's like, really, I'm getting paid for this.
Exactly. I get paid to pretend to be other people for a living. How did I manage to wangle that? That's ridiculous. It's great.
True.
But yeah, so it's what were we talking about before?
We were talking about favorite moments in commentary before you, as you said that you love your tangents.
I do.
That, folks, was 100% completely freestyle, completely unscripted, courtesy of my welcome guest. So thank you for that, Daniel, because actually it was a really, really good story. That's the thing. Commentary or talking about a story is about conveying something that's of interest, that as soon as you hear one thing, you're expecting, well, what is he going to say about it next? And that's what we do as commentators. So, we were talking about favorite moments in commentary, and you were talking about when you were about to do your first ever commentary as well, weren't you?
Yes. So back to that. I think I've identified in my head in that moment you were speaking there as to why I went on that particular tangent. So it's to do with this idea that I'm on a live broadcast in front of a live audience for the first time in a little while, because it was during the pandemic. I'd not done any theatre work. I still haven't done any theatre work since I was in training. So 2017 was the last time I did live theatre work. Since then, obviously, I've done plenty of other bits and pieces in recorded media. And if I'm honest, I kind of prefer recorded media. But yeah, you get that energy from an audience in live performance. And then as it turns out, when you're then doing a live virtual performance, you still get an energy there in the knowledge that there's an audience listening to. And so it was very excited to make that transition across from the recorded performance of highlights and so on, then to the exciting stuff of a live broadcast, live and uncut. So that's definitely one of the big moments in commentary for me. I think then another one has got to be Canada 2011. Because that was the dream team that a lot of people refer to. That was Brundle and Coulthard, 4-hour-long race, Button in and out the pit lane however many times, at the back of the field, taking penalties, 6 times.
Hamilton and him coming together on the start-finish straight, and then Sebastian Vettel loses it with half a lap to go in the chicane.
Exactly, and that was a race. I was in school at the time. I was what was I doing that year? I was in the first year of my GCSEs that year, so I was in year 10 in school.
Okay.
And and so I was sat there watching, and I went to from year 3 to the end of upper sixth. I went to a private school. Because we've, like I alluded to earlier on, we've never really been, until sort of recent times, after unfortunately for me, after I've then moved out and become an adult, my family's never really had money up until that point. And even then, whilst on paper my folks have money, in reality they don't, because it's all being spent on things like mortgages and things like that, which they've had to get so late in life because of the aforementioned military service. So so the reason that we went to private school was then because of the military, because they paid for it. Essentially they paid, I think it's like they paid 95% of a boarding school fee, because essentially it gives the child stability, gives you roots, gives you friends, gives you all these things. So the place that I'm in now, my flat, I share with formerly shared with 3 of my friends that I've known for now over 15 years, that I went to school with up in the northeast of England. And it's only recently changed because one of them went traveling in Southeast Asia for 5 months, and they didn't want to pay the rent during that time. So we've got someone else in now who's new, and they're great. But yeah, in terms of that Canada 2011, so I was in school. I'd gotten special permission to stay up late and do my homework, because the race would have been on whilst I was doing my homework, essentially. So I did homework early. I got permission from the housemaster and all these sorts of things, and I was then sat watching it. And then, of course, because of all the rain, it extended it and extended it and extended it. and I remember final lap, Button comes by. And obviously I was a Hamilton fan more than a Button fan, but it was still a McLaren, and it was still a British driver, and they were still overtaking Sebastian Vettel, who, as mentioned before, I didn't like at Red Bull. At that point, yeah. So I see him going off. I see Button going through, the loudest cheer in my life, and then all of a sudden the teacher. So we had what we called the junior common room, was where I was sat, and so it was there was the TV in front of you. There was a couple of sofas and a pool table behind you, and then it was all sort of encompassed by a banister. I think because that used to be open, like you used to be able to look down into the ground floor of the school, and then they'd filled it in at some point. But just behind the banister was the tuck shop, the sweetie shop. And, and that was being manned by the deputy head of the deputy housemaster at the time, who was on duty that evening. And their reaction to me suddenly going, yes, when a bunch of people in the rooms just there and there were supposed to be sleeping was Daniel, shut up. So I remember that one quite clearly. And then the other thing in commentary, which I would remember, if we're only picking 3, would be, again, one which was someone else rather than me doing it. And I think this one is something which obviously anybody who was watching F1 in the mid-2000s in the UK is going to know, is that clock. That's the moment when we suddenly got, for me, it was the first ever British champion in my lifetime. So it was a moment there of being an F1 fan for, at that point, 8-9 years or so. And that was the first time that not only my team had won, but my driver had won as well. Where, 2005, 2006, I'd sort of supported Alonso. I hadn't really wanted to in 2005 because he was against the McLarens. But then, of course, when McLaren were a bit more out of it in 2006, I was a bit more inclined to support him. And then, of course, the heartbreak of 2007, missing out on by 1 point for both McLaren drivers. And then, of course, all the other things to do with Spygate and other bits and pieces in the Constructors' Championship, which means that even still to this day, despite the successes they've had since, McLaren's last Constructors' title in 1998. So a long, long time ago for Constructors' glory. But yeah, it's so that one that sticks in the memory. I remember that day. I remember me and my dad suddenly jumping up off of the sofa, saying all sorts of things that would not be appropriate for this podcast.
Well, I've said the word bollocks in this podcast, so I think that would go a stretch too far with what you and your dad said at that point.
Yeah, we'd be dropping f-bombs. I'll be honest. It's a bit like a 12A film. You're allowed one f-bomb. Where do you put it? It's like any more than that, it goes up to a 15. I think they drop an, again, off topic for a brief second here, but I watched Avatar 2 the other day. I'm fairly certain there's an f-bomb in that film.
Well, I haven't seen that one yet.
I'm not going to spoil anything, but I'm fairly certain. When you do see it, message me if you also spot it,
mate. I'll be straight on the Discord. I'll be straight onto Discord, sliding into your DMs and saying, yeah, actually they did. Cheeky beggars. Yeah, and then of course after that we actually had back-to-back British teams and British team with a British driver, Braun GP, and
Yep.
the man who was going to be his teammate in 2010, Jenson Button. So
Yeah.
last ever time that we've actually had two different British drivers back-to-back as world championship drivers in Formula One.
Yeah, and the greatest, the most fun thing you can do with discussion of those two as well is 2008 championship is won by a Mercedes powered British team with a British driver in mixed conditions, with the number 22 on the front of the car.
Yep.
And then in 2009 it was a Mercedes powered British team with a British driver in mixed conditions in Brazil with the number 22 on the car.
Yeah.
And it's it's great. I'm sure there'll be even more things that you could pull out there as far as similarities are concerned, but they're just the ones I can go do off the top of my head. It's great. Isn't it great when sport does something silly like that and it's just organic and it works? It's great. I love it.
It does. It does. Well, the final question before we wrap things up. Thank you very much for being a guest here, Daniel. It's been an absolute hoot. I know this is a long episode, folks, but it's been one that's been filled with tangents, factual trivia of the relatable kind, and then the complete random kind when we talked about the pornographic industry and VHS trumping Betamax earlier on. But final question, and I always like this one because this has it's a double-edged sword kind of situation. It's two flip sides of the coin. So I ask my guests this question, folks, if you don't already remember the format on this. I ask my guests the question, and then I have to provide my response to said question as well. And said question is, if you had an unlimited budget and you could choose any car on four wheels that is currently being used or has previously been used, and you take it to any racetrack of your choice, there's no glass ceiling on this, what would you go for?
That's really tricky. I know the track. I'd take it to Spa.
Okay.
That's easy. But the car is really difficult because I've got what I call it used to be the Holy Trinity. It's now the Holy Quadrinity. Because, there are these four cars which as you say, if money were no object, then I would get myself a nice house. And then in the house, a bit like a sort of a mini MTC with a boulevard, I'd have these four cars on display.
Okay. On this particular episode, because you've got the Holy Quadrinity, go for it.
Okay. So what order do you want them in? Do you want them oldest to youngest? Do you want them in random order?
Any particular order you like. This is your question to answer, and then I will reciprocate accordingly.
Okay. We'll go oldest to youngest. So first one would be the MP46 from 1991. So number of reasons for that. First of all, I think it's the prettiest car that has ever been made. And I say that as a car, not just a Formula One car. I just think that as a car, it's the most pretty thing that has ever been made.
Okay.
It's obviously then got that whacking great Honda V12 in the back, the last ever World Championship winner for a H-pattern gearbox, last Senna Championship winner as well. Great championship scrap with Mansell and Williams that year. It's everything to do with old school Formula One that I love. The only thing that could improve that car, and literally the only thing, and it's all down to personal preference, there'll be a lot of people who would disagree with me on this, would be if you instead took out the V12 and put in either the V10 from the previous year in 90 and 89, or you put in a V10 from the early 2000s. That would be the perfect car then, in my opinion. So that would be car number one.
Okay.
Car number two would be then the MP416. So the 2001 car. Now that car won a few races, got a few pole positions, but it wasn't a championship winner. And but it does have significance for me because 2001 was my first full season watching, because I obviously got sort of airdropped in midway through 2000. And so 2001 first full season. That's the one which I have a lot of nostalgia for that season review DVD as well that I mentioned that came with the game as well. And it was the car which Coulthard got his best ever championship position in as well. Second place in the championship that year to Schumacher. Managed to beat Barrichello as well, of course, in the other Ferrari. So that gave you some idea of just how well he'd been driving that year, how well the McLaren had been, if not for it being a bit unreliable at times and things like that. Obviously, Ferrari had a bit of a march as well. So in terms of that, for me, for nostalgia reasons, for a connection to the sort of my roots of my love for the sport, got to be that car. Plus, you get that wonderful V10 soundtrack as well, which is just, honestly, if I were in charge of the new engine rules for 2026, I would have said, yes, we're going to have all the things that have been agreed, but we're going to get rid of this V6 as the internal combustion engine, and instead you're going to go to a V10 3-liter again. That's going to be the way. Nice high revving thing, get it up to 20,000 revs again. So that one is number 2 in the quadrinity. Number 3 is then got to be 2008's car, the MP423. The wonderful thing, when you see it in person, it just beggars belief that every single thing on that car is there for a reason. Everything there has its purpose. Nothing is put on a Formula One car just for the sake of it. Everything is there because it has a reason. And that reason is to make the car go faster. Bit of trivia for you on that particular car. They'd gotten to the end of that rule cycle that was broadly speaking the same from 98 to 2008. And that car, obviously you had some changes here and there with things like wing heights and all these other bits and pieces, but relatively small. And so that car was producing enough downforce. It was the equivalent of 1 fully grown African elephant sat on the front and 2 sat on the back. That's how much weight was pressing that car into the ground. Of course, Hamilton winner, championship winner as well. Got to be that car. The final car is one which, again, is not being chosen necessarily for its achievements, but
no, that's fair enough.
For its personal connection to me. And driving this one around Spa would be a lot more difficult, I think, because it would be the 2018 car, the MCL 33. That car, one of the worst in McLaren's history in terms of constructor position and results and all that sort of a thing. But it was my car. That was the year I was there. I was building that car. I was putting it together. I was doing these kitting orders. I was doing goods inwards. I was doing all these things to help the team to build a Formula One car. And it's the only time I've ever done that in my life, unless, of course, you count the work we were doing for the 19 car before the end of the 18 season. Maybe then you could argue that I've helped put 2 F1 cars together. But yeah, that was my car. And it was Alonso's last McLaren, unless, of course, at the end of his Aston contract, he decides he wants a 3rd round. And it's got this wonderful papaya livery to it. It looks like what you'd imagine Bruce would make his car look like in the modern day. It has a lot of meaning to me, that car, even though, as I say, it's not particularly successful or good or anything, because we didn't get the front suspension right.
I have to say, a quadrinity beyond reproach there, Mr. Gilligan. Right.
So what was your response?
Okay. Now, I've gone with a bit of a mixture here, but I think you're going to like this as well.
Okay. So,
in response to the circuit choice, you said Spa. I'll say Autodromo Nazionale di Monza, the Temple of Speed. Okay. 1991, you say MP46. I say Williams Renault FW14 with the Renault RS3 3.5 litre V10, which Mr. Mansell was piloting that year. 2001, you said the MP416. I'm going to go with the first ever championship winning car for Scuderia Ferrari for Michael Schumacher, the F1 2000 Ferrari, piloted that year also by Rubens Barrichello. MP423 in 2008. 2008 was also a halcyon year. Funnily enough, it was the final year that a certain Scot was still racing in Formula One. And so I'm going to go with not just any particular Red Bull, but one car. And unfortunately, this car did not make it very far in the race at Interlagos. It is the Wings for Life RB3.
Yeah.
And then the 2018 MCL 33. Well, looking at that, I'm going to go with the RS18 from Renault. And the reason being, because 2 drivers in that team, one remained the following season, and one went on to McLaren the following year, Carlos Sainz Jr.
Absolutely.
So there you have it, folks. Episode 15 is in the books. Daniel, thank you very much for your time, buddy. It's been an absolute hoot having you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex. It's been very good fun. I've enjoyed it very much.
So I've got to ask one final question, and it's for the folks out there. Where can they find you, if at all, on social media?
You can find me in a number of different places. I have an Instagram as far as social media goes. So that is at DA Gilligan. Gilligan spelt Gilligan, and not UN or ON or whatever else people want to throw in there. I've then got a YouTube channel, which has not really got much on it at the moment, but there is a project that I'm working on, which I'm not going to release anything until the whole thing is done. And we're about halfway there. So that will be youtube.com/@DA Gilligan. Again, nice and easy to remember. And then if you want to watch me play video games and generally hang out, then that would be twitch.tv/Daniel Gilligan. With, I don't know if it makes a difference, but a capital D and a capital G.
And all those links are down in the description below for you all to find out. That's it. We've got episode 15, the first one where pornography and thespianism has just been discussed in the same episode. Big thank you to Daniel. Big thank you for you all to watching. If you haven't already, check out the remainder of the playlist. We've got some fantastic guests on there that have already taken part. Don't forget, this is also going to be available very, very soon on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time here on Commentator's Corner.